Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gina Ligon. I'm the director of NCITE, which is the Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence for Counterterrorism and Terrorism Prevention Research. Today, we are in our third installment of this year's speaker series. This speaker series was really the inception of an idea from one of our board members from Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships at Department of Homeland Security. And the purpose of this speaker series is really to highlight some of the really good policy and research work going on in terrorism and targeted violence prevention. This is one of NCITE's central research themes that we're trying to generate new knowledge on here at University of Nebraska, Omaha, where NCITE is headquartered. And so as a consequence, we wanted to invite some of the very tippy top government officials who are charged with this mission. A few house cleaning items before I introduce today's speaker. So we will have about a 45-minute program. And part of that is because even though it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, East Coast time, we have the largest showing that we have had for a speaker series event so far. So I attribute that to our wonderful guest speaker, Dr. John Picarelli from the National Security Council. So what I'll do to make sure we get through that 45-minute program is I'm going to take speaker's prerogative, moderator's prerogative, and ask him all the questions that keep me up at night first. Then we'll have a chance to go to audience Q&A. There won't actually be a way for you to speak, ask your questions, but what you can do is you can submit your questions via the chat, and I will read your questions and attribute them to you by your first name if you have it on there for our guest speaker. So we'll go through a few minutes of questions for us, and then we'll have some audience Q&A, and then in about 5 business days, we'll actually send out this particular speaker series and be able to have a roundup of all that was discussed. And so everyone who is here today will be able to see it, and then we'll have the YouTube recording on our NCITE YouTube channel. So now that I've gone through the show flow, let me talk to you about the background of our speaker. So we have John Picarelli with us today. John Picarelli is the Director of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention for the Counterterrorism Directorate of the National Security Council. And in that role, he is an advisor to the president and other members of the National Security Council about what are the very best scientific practices to keep us safe and to prevent terrorism and targeted violence in the United States. He's also co-chairing the effort about other types of hate-based violence, particularly the strategy on countering anti-Semitism and other forms of bias and discrimination that he'll talk a bit about today. But before he joined the NSC, Dr. Picarelli was actually the chair and director, and the DAS, which stands for Deputy Assistant Secretary. I've never actually known what DAS stood for, so I was excited to see that spelled out when I was doing research about you. That he was the DAS at Department of Homeland Security for this same mission, but he also was the director of the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, where he was oversaw and developed 5 major lines of effort in driving DHS's mission in being responsible for coordinating the prevention of all forms of terrorism and targeted violence in the United States. As you can see, he also has a PhD. He is a professor at American University in all of his free time and does a lot of thought work and still does some article writing on these issues. So I'd first like to just welcome you, John, to joining us. I'm really grateful. I can see you are likely in the Eisenhower building, and very grateful that you're here today and giving us your time on a Friday afternoon. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks for having me. Actually, this is my living room. I'm working from home today. And I first and foremost, I sincerely apologize for missing folks a couple weeks ago. One of the things about working here is there are certain people that will call you last minute into meetings, and you do not have the latitude to say no. And so I'm really happy to join you today and have turned off my phone for 45 minutes. So I'm all yours.
Okay, well, let's get started. So I'm going to ask you the first question. As you know, I'm an org psychologist. I'm really interested in how you developed and came to be where you are today. So could you talk to us a little bit about like any career experiences you've had, mentors, how, you know, your background education, any kind of seminal developmental event that you think has led you to where you are at the National Security Council?
Sure. It's a great question. So first and foremost, all of my degree work has been in international relations. So one of the things I always have really appreciated about international relations is really it's not a discipline, more a combination of disciplines, whether it's sociology or political science or geography and many others, economics, obviously, history. So what it does is it trains you to look at problems from a variety of different lenses. And coming out of my undergrad and moving through my master's work, I really started to become fascinated with this concept of transnational threats. You know, this is the mid-1990s. We're coming out of the Cold War. Security is really redefining itself. Nobody really knows what's coming next. And this whole notion of organized crime groups that are operating across borders and the growth of forms of terrorism that look nothing like what we saw in the 70s and 80s. The continued evolution of drug trafficking networks, and by the end of that decade, something called cyber. Remember Y2K and how much fun we had with that. I'm sure there's more than a few kids on here right now looking that up in the Google machine. So that is really what has kind of defined the journey for me, is that I've always been really fascinated with the evolution and the growth of these transnational threats and how they get to be so significant that they challenge the power of nation states in many places. And so I've been blessed throughout my career to work with really great thinkers, whether it was Phil Williams at Pittsburgh or Louise Shelley at AU. And at every stage, I mean, I could sit here and use 45 minutes to do my thank you speech for the Oscars, right? But I've really been able to take every position I've had and kind of use it to get that next position. And so, you know, leaving AU, having worked at a research center for a number of years there on transnational crime, I end up at the Justice Department, where I run research for 10 years, and I am looking at trafficking in persons and organized crime, and eventually get asked to stand up a program on something called domestic radicalization of violent extremism. So I dive in on that and suddenly start learning about behavioral science in a way that I hadn't really before. And that led me to the Department of Homeland Security, because eventually it was time to go do something about this as opposed to just learning about it, but take all that research with me and so forth. And that led, you know, worked with a phenomenal team there for many years, sadly, a very small team with a very small budget, but punching well above its fighting weight. And that eventually grew into what is now CP3, and has really grown in a way that's really enheartening. And I don't know, some of you on this line today might have been on the webinar earlier with Elizabeth Newman, who was the Assistant Secretary for a few years during the Trump administration, and we made great strides then. And that work has continued under the leadership of Bill Braniff and Jenny Presswala and Kareem Shora and the whole team over there in ways that is just really, really great. So, you know, Gina, I'll end with, if you're a psychologist, please don't get in this brain, because it's scary. There is no one thing that leads me to the National Security Council, except that if you're working in security in Washington, D.C., and you say, oh, I would never want to work for the National Security Council, you're lying. It is just the experience of a lifetime.
Yeah, that's I remember reading your article, Transnational Criminal Organizations, before I knew you. And I won't tell you how old I was, but I wasn't as old as you were, I will say that. And when you wrote it, and it was transformative because it was about looking at drug cartels, human trafficking, transnational organizations as organizations. And so it really, I think, shaped my entry into this field with how you wrote that. So thank you for that. You didn't know you were inspiring someone in Oklahoma, but you were.
I'll just say blind squirrel finds a nut every so often. Thank you.
No, it's good. Well, I want to talk about the National Security Council with you a bit. It is the pinnacle job for someone in national security, from my perception. So can you break it down like we are your smart cousins? And so, we have some idea of where you are right now, but tell us about like what that means to be on the NSC. Like, who are you counsel to? And anything you can to sort of help us understand what the NSC does would be helpful.
Sure. So the National Security Council it's an interesting creation. As you know, coming out of the Second World War, there's a landmark piece of legislation, the National Security Act, in 1947, and among its many parts was the formation of something called the National Security Council, and it was created to provide a body to the president for all matters of national security, and that is essentially what it was then and what it remains today. Our principal job is to advise the president and other senior officials in the White House on all matters of national security and foreign policy. We do that by coordinating the various departments and agencies and offices of the federal government. So a lot of what we do, we speak in this kind of veiled code of things like IPCs and CSGs and sub-IPCs and so forth and so forth. All those are just fancy ways of saying we are gathering up the interagency to talk about an issue. And the importance about that is every agency has its authorities and capabilities and budgets and personnel. And so when you're looking at an issue, you want to ensure that you have your diplomats, you have your law enforcement, you have your policy writers, you have your legislative experts, and a wide variety from across all these departments to bring all of that to bear in a way that is coordinated and therefore efficient to deal with the problem, but also to hear different perspectives and arrive at a consensus that then goes up through the National Security Advisor to the president. This council has changed, and it changes every administration. It's one of the very first things that a new president will do is they will deem what their National Security Council will look like and who will be on it and so forth. And so we are usually broken up into what are called directorates, right? So each directorate is either going to be a regional or a functional one. The regionals are various parts of the globe, and they're looking at how we're dealing with certain countries. And then the functional ones are like where I am, where I work in counterterrorism. And the folks that I work with deal not only with counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, embassy security, hostage rescue, counter-transnational organized crime, counterterrorism around the globe, and then counterterrorism here at home. And then there's me, who does prevention work. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We are a fairly large team. We do a lot of work with one another. We try not to ever surprise one another. It's a very collegial atmosphere here. Everyone understands that the phrase NSC time really means something. Like you just have to keep moving at a fast clip, and we all understand the importance of what we're doing. We never question why we're at something. We just roll up our sleeves and get it done. And that's been true not just of this administration, but the previous administration and all the ones before it. It's really a kind of a unique place, given the gravity of some of the things that we have to grapple with on a day in and day out basis. The last thing I'll just say, Gina, if you will, is that this organization changed dramatically after 9/11 and really by about 2003 with the introduction of a Homeland Security Advisor who I work with very closely. And so there is an important mission that's added to the NSC coming out of 9/11 to really look at Homeland Security issues as well. So you will have everything from natural disasters to cybersecurity to where I am in counterterrorism and everything in between, that is also being run through the NSC process up to the president. And so that has expanded the remit of the National Security Council, but I just want to make sure folks understood that even though it's Homeland Security, it's embedded in really a core part of the National Security Council.
Wow. So she has that whole portfolio. She has like natural disasters and cyber, like the Homeland Security Advisor is all of that. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a big job.
So you've been in this role a little bit under 2 years. In looking at your CV and all of the places you've worked, is there anything that you wish you could have learned or done differently to be better prepared? Is there any advice you would give to anyone entering this role about how to be prepared for a role like the one you're in?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. With me, I'd worked with the National Security Council and for so many different administrations, I had a sense of the pulse and the way it works here. And I had the pleasure of working with my predecessor quite closely for a number of years. So coming in, I kind of knew her work and the team's work here. And I think that's important, but I mean, if anything, I wish I just slept more before I got this job. It would have been really helpful. It's funny. It's the fall of 2022, and I was supposed to be going up to Pittsburgh for the Eradicate Hate Conference, and I get COVID, right? So here I'm sitting on my back deck with COVID, and I grabbed a book called White House Warriors, which sounds like a trashy novel at the airport, but it's actually someone's dissertation research that turned into a book. And the reason I was reading it is because so many books that are out there talk about the role of the National Security Advisor and how that's changed over time. John Gantz's book is about our job, the national security staff, and what we do and how we do it. And it was really, really fascinating to read it. Even though I thought I knew some things about the National Security Council, I realized how much I didn't. So, I mean, here, if I have any one piece of advice, it's just be flexible because there is no such thing as a typical day.
Yeah.
If I to illustrate that, about this time last week, I'm just about getting ready to, pack up and head home. I know what I have to do over the weekend, and I get a call that basically upends everything. And I remember calling my wife afterwards and saying, "Hey, remember I said I'd be home in an hour? Yeah, I'll be home about 9." And essentially I had to immediately put out large data calls to big agencies that I needed immediately in order to do this. And then spent the entire weekend. I think Saturday I spent all day doing nothing but rereading and going back through notes and looking at what was coming in from the data call, and doing a lot of research, and spent all day Sunday writing to get something ready by Monday morning. And by Monday, we were organizing a meeting on Wednesday that was actually just reported out in Axios, so I can talk about it, where we hosted principals from across the interagency to talk about anti-Semitism and what's happening in this country right now. And that as we come towards the end of year one of the National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism, we have to start focusing on year two. And so that was the purpose of the principals meeting. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of prep work that needs to go into that, talking to the agencies, answering all their questions, making sure they're coming prepared, preparing your bosses who are going to be running that meeting, and everything in between. And so that gets us to Wednesday. We get through that meeting, and then the summary of that meeting has to be written, and more memos have to be written. All the while, there's legislation coming off the Hill that everybody wants to know your opinion on. And there is other things, obviously, that are ongoing in this country that are, you're being asked for your opinion, or you're helping other teams with, and so on and so on. That's a typical week here. That is, there are the goals you come in with and the issues you're going to try and move forward, and you do that, but you have to realize that other duties as assigned sometimes is your full-time job. And so that having that flexibility in mind really pays dividends down the road when you're working here.
Hearing this in the last 2 years, like what are you proudest of? I mean, you've done like it's been a constant water hose of activity that I mean, I think about the domestic terrorism strategy, the first one that's ever been written, the strategy for anti-Semitism, your work on Islamophobia, like what is something, if you could just, and even if it's, small, but that maybe we don't know about, but what are you proud of right now, just hearing all that?
You know, I hope to be prouder of certain things in about 6 to 8 months when I'm dropping the mic and leaving here. But honestly, I think the thing that I'm most proud of is watching an interagency community grow around prevention that speaks of one voice about public health, really. And what we've seen is a lot of the previous barriers to that work have dropped. They're not all dropped, obviously, and we will talk about some of the key issues we need to continue to work on. But I take no credit for that. I'm just incredibly proud of it. I mean, the teams that are at the various departments across the federal government, the work that's happening at the state and local level, it's become something that is, moving forward at a pace, which is great to see. And I think that really brings me some solace, to see that happening, especially given where some of that work was, 5 or 6 years ago, where it was literally on life support in many agencies. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition. You've sated my curiosity to talk to a real life NSC member about what it's like. So I'll move into what we came for, which is to talk about this prevention mission. You mentioned the public health approach. Can you break down what you think is working, what you think is not working, and what gaps are still existing for us to, as researchers, but also the interagency and community, to try to solve?
Yeah. So the way I've been approaching this recently is to kind of go back to the public health approach and the 4 stages of it that the CDC uses. They outline a really well thought out logic model of 4 steps, really, right? So the first step is, and to just kind of put the bottom line up front, I think we've done a really good job on the first 3 steps. Not to say we're done, because it's an enduring issue, each of these that I'll outline in a moment. And I think where we really need to work now is the 4th step. All right. So the first step is just to define the problem. And if you go back and you look at documents in 2017, 2018, 2019, we were able to, not only as DHS, but as other agencies, start to really hone in on the fact that we don't just focus on terrorism, we also have to focus on targeted violence. That the toolkit that we have in the prevention space, the research continues to show that prevention programs shouldn't be bespoke to specific forms of terrorism or terrorism writ broadly. It should also address targeted violence as well. And I think the strategic framework at DHS in 2019 is a great example of that, where we were able to work all that in and fairly uncontroversially put that out. And that's, I believe, still somewhat in force at DHS. It hasn't been pulled down yet. So that's kind of the first step, is defining what it is we're doing. What is targeted violence? What is terrorism? What are we looking at? And the process, the pathway to violence that brings folks to those forms. The second step is really about it's really about trying to look at the risk and the protective factors and understanding the why, right? And what we've seen for year over year over year is the research just continues to march forward, which is really enheartening. And whether we look at the recent publication that that Gill et al. Have put out on threat assessment and management, the work that's happening around the globe, the work you guys have recently launched with your colleagues around the globe and trying to lash up all the centers of excellence. I mean, that's really, really important. And then the third phase is that kind of, okay, now that if we know what we're trying to prevent and we know within reason why we think individuals come to that, then what are we going to, how are we going to approach that? What programs are we going to use? And there's been I wouldn't say an explosion, that's probably not the right word, but a real ramping up of a variety of initiatives. Sometimes under, threat assessment, sometimes under engagement, under recidivism, looking at the online space and online interventions. And if you go over now to the Prevention Resource Finder, which is hosted by DHS, but compiles the interagency's approaches, I mean, there's already over 100 different things that you can do to prevent targeted violence and terrorism. So that's all starting to culminate in state strategies. You're seeing New York, Colorado, Illinois, Hawaii, a number of them are developing these strategies, and now they're implementing on them, right? We're talking constantly with Homeland Security advisors at state levels and with others, and they are preventing targeted violence and terrorism. Yes, when you intervene with an individual, we do not know what they would have gone on and done. We understand that, but in some of these cases, the prevention mission clearly stopped somebody who was having serious thoughts of perhaps recreating the Buffalo shooting or joining some very pernicious forms of domestic terrorism online and so forth. So to me, that's really the good news here. We have a baseline now that didn't exist 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we were in trial and error. Now we have a baseline, right? But that brings us to the fourth stage, and that's the issue we're at hand. The other side of the coin, if the first side of the coin is to build the baseline, the second side is to then bring it to scale. And that's the real challenge facing us now. With limited resources and with a mental health crisis ongoing in this country, and with a lot of competing issues facing state and local mayors and governors and law enforcement, how do we smartly bring this to scale in a way that doesn't build a capability that's very expensive and underutilized, but is timely, is scaled and scoped properly, and is effective, right? That's really the challenge that faces us now, and that's really the work I'm working on with my interagency partners now. How do we do this? How do we work with one another? How do we look at building off other programs, coordinating with other forms of prevention, and also really looking at a variety of new ways of trying to do this work in order to build that to scale.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about those four components of public health approach, and one of the things that resonates with me today that I don't think I've heard you say, or maybe just didn't fully understand it, but just this notion of how you scale something when you have all these competing priorities. And so I do want to just give a shout out to a beautiful org design that your organization, when you were the director of CP3, and those are those regional prevention coordinators that they have, and it's modeled after this public health approach. I know that we have Tiffany Sewell, who is on right now. She's the regional prevention coordinator for Colorado. And so that's one of the states you mentioned. And just what she's been able to do in that state and some of the state legislation and state support for this is absolutely critical to be able to make that a scalable and enduring, sustainable practice in her state, just like we have for other public health issues in our country. So thank you for kind of bringing that home for me today, because I hadn't really latched onto that as much as I should have. So that was great. In terms of the role of government, so we're talking about the federal layer, the federal support from DHS of designing some of these programs, the interagency. But the public health model is really that whole of society approach to prevention. So, thinking about the title of this speaker series, how do you recommend that the federal government go about balancing that need for security, which is, in the name of counterterrorism and terrorism prevention, with civil rights and civil liberties? Like, what is that? What's the role of the government in that space?
Yeah. It's vital. It is absolutely vital. I mean, the privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties really have to be not part of the prevention mission. They have to be what drives the prevention mission. And to me, the public health approach, one of its core strengths, is that civil rights and civil liberties are embedded at every stage, right? Think about kind of what we just walked through, developing a definition of the issue. You're making clear what it is that you are targeting, and therefore you're also making clear what you are not, right? And part of the whole point of the public health approach is to get help to individuals before they cause harm to others, of course. But the unstated part of it is before they do harm to themselves, before they're arrested, before they're put into the criminal justice system, before they potentially do something where they are killed themselves, right? Or ruin their lives. So if we look at the work on risk and protective factors and all the research, Gina, I'm going to use a term that you're very familiar with, institutional review boards, right? You have human subjects protection embedded at every step of the research to ensure we're protecting the privacy of individuals and that we're looking at this in the right way. And then as we move into the programs, it has to be embedded. It has to be abundantly clear that First Amendment rights, your Fourth Amendment rights, your other constitutional civil liberties, and your privacy are all really vital if this is going to work. Look, if the work we do on targeted violence and terrorism prevention labels somebody in a way that ruins their life, we fail. So privacy is incredibly important, not because of laws, but just because the whole process fails if privacy isn't protected. And civil rights and civil liberties are the same. If we're designing programs that are violating all the variety of First Amendment rights, and obviously right now we're looking at what's happening in our campuses across this country right now. And you've heard the president speak yesterday about the need to balance the ability to speak out and protect that, but do it in a way that's responsible. That's everything that we're thinking about in a different way about targeted violence and terrorism prevention. So the bottom line is this entire process, everything we've outlined so far, is rooted in evidence, not bias. It's using efficacy as its guide. It's saying we will do what is effective, and that which is not effective we will not do, and we will explain why. So I'll just conclude again with where I started. I think civil rights, civil liberties, protections, privacy is at every stage of this, and therefore, it's incumbent on government at all levels to ensure that there are open lines of communications. If there is anything in an implementation that is not meeting the fidelity of the intent of what we've designed, we need to be made aware of that. It needs to be corrected immediately. And obviously, if there's civil rights violations, there's ways to adjudicate that and make sure it doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, it really struck me when we held the International Academic Partnerships for Science and Security. So this was what you alluded to earlier, a big convening of all the other centers of excellence like NCITE in other Western democracies, and the difference, the balance that we as Americans make between First and Fourth Amendment and privacy rights that other Western democracies with their interventions are not. They don't have the same constitution, the same First Amendment freedom of speech and right to protest that we have. And so I'm really grateful that you took time to talk about it. It actually has to be one of the goals and how you embed that into all of these interventions, at least in the United States. So it struck me when I was at IAPS that we are unique in that plight among a lot of our counterparts. Um, in terms of, when we first picked this date, which you were called out of, unfortunately, with a meeting that you could not say no to, it was April 19th. That date is important to me and a lot of Americans, but also specifically people in our field, because that date is the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, where an anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist who was also identified with the white identity movement uh, bombed a federal building in my home state of Oklahoma. We chose that date for your talk because we wanted you to talk to us about what's changed in the last 30 years. Is 29 years ago, 2 weeks ago, that bombing happened. Um, what could you tell us about what's changed, what hasn't changed since April 19th, 1995?
Yeah, uh, I think one of the most important things that has changed is that we have seen an evolution in what happened that day, right? I think we would look back on the perpetrators of the Oklahoma City bombing, and we might say, hey, they're anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists, agaves. Others might look at them and say, well, actually, they're more racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, REMVs. And others would say you're both right. Um, and we've seen that continue. That hasn't gone away, but it is, in some ways, it has grown and it has continued to morph. A lot of what we continue to see is the evolution of these threats within the country itself, right? We're also seeing that tied to forms of violence and forms of targeted violence that are really driven by hate-fueled narratives that equivocate with terrorism, but they're not aligned with some of the ideological underpinnings of these violent extremist movements, right? Um, and then I think the last thing, and this has come up quite a bit, everyone has a different term for it, but we're continuously seeing individuals come to terrorism or targeted violence for a hodgepodge of ideological and non-ideological reasons. This is a real challenge, and when you layer on top of that the birth of the internet and then of course of social media, we're starting to see some shifts in the threat landscape. We're continuing to see younger and younger individuals start to engage in this kind of activity. But interestingly, we've also seeing older and older individuals engage in this kind of activity as well. I think on top of all of that, we're dealing with a very dynamic threat landscape that is constantly changing. You see new groups popping up every so often, or new movements, probably is a better way of putting it. And we're continuing to have to deal with things from overseas, whether that's ISIS or Al Qaeda or what have you, all at a time when counterterrorism resources are actually not growing anymore, right? So I think really what we're dealing with aligns very well for advocation to say prevention really needs to be looked at as a serious toolkit to deal with all of this. If we're going to continue to invest in investigation, arrest, mitigation, protection, which we need to do, I'm not saying we don't. But if that is all we are going to do, we are not going to have the resources in order to do that. They're going to have to be trade-offs. But by investing in prevention, we may be able to reduce some of these threats before they become a harm, and therefore take some of the burden off of law enforcement, take some of the burden off of security planning, and also therefore allow some of these resources that are more limited to be utilized for some of the other equally serious issues we have to deal with. We talk with law enforcement, federal law enforcement, almost every day, and I'm in awe at the number of things that they have to chase down on any given day. And there literally is just not enough people to deal with this. So I'll just say that I think we need to continue to look at finding these effective prevention programs and scaling them up, looking for partners both within and outside government in order to bring them to scale, and then to continue to measure the impact as best we can to see how it can reduce the pressure on law enforcement at all levels, security planners, and others. And in that, we're in a much different place than we were in 1995 when that happened. And you know, I remember that distinctly. I'm old enough to remember that. But I also remember Khobar Towers not a year or two later, and I remember the embassy bombing not a year or two later. And that was essentially when you started to see in the literature people talking about transnational terrorism being written. I think it was Walter LaCour put a piece in Foreign Affairs by that title. And you started to understand something was changing here, right? And while we sadly had 9/11 happen and we very much had to rapidly deal with a new paradigm dealing with international terrorism, domestic terrorism never really went away. And now if you look at all the threat landscape assessments that come out of DHS or DOJ, you're starting to kind of hear that not only come back into balance, but in many ways to say domestic terrorist movements are really more of a concerning threat to us than some others.
Yeah, that gives me hope. So thank you. As a native Oklahoman, that a lot has changed and we're not in the same place. We have so many questions that are pouring in right now, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm gonna pick the one that I want to ask you from the crowd. So as you know, NCITE is a consortium of academics across the country and internationally. We have a lot of students who have dialed in today, a lot of professors who dialed in. We have, I think, 400 students in the country that are part of NCITE. And they are all watching you and wanting to learn. So I'm going to ask the question from the crowd. I have one consortium member that has asked, what's the role of academia when you talk about interagency and how you work in and outside of government? So to include centers of excellence like NCITE in supporting this national security, but also terrorism and targeted violence.
I think it's vital. And I don't think it's just for me. I think for others as well. We value good, solid, empirically done academic research. Whether that is quantitative or qualitative in design is immaterial to us. We constantly have scholars coming and visiting us here and presenting their work. And it is an incredible tool that I draw on quite frequently. There are people here who can listen to me talk all day, and sadly they have to. But sometimes it's far more effective to have somebody else from the academic community come in and make the point. Maybe the academic researcher has a way of explaining it that I don't, and they can get that point across. So it's vital. I mean, I think there is a very porous membrane between this building and academia, and that's for good reason. We actually in this building have two large libraries that we are constantly adding new books to and checking them out. Obviously, we with so many people visiting for conferences or what have you, it is not uncommon to have folks visiting us and to put talks on not only for my colleagues in the NSC, but for the Domestic Policy Council and in the Office of Science and Technology Policy and so forth. So, yeah, I think it's I've never, this goes back to when I was at DOJ, I understand that academics speak in a slightly less penetrable language, but guess what? So do we too. And so oftentimes I viewed my role as trying to help sharpen the policy recommendations of really good research and help policy makers better articulate research questions that can be then interrogated by academics.
Yep. Thank you. I will leave that just to summarize for all of the consortium members that are watching, that he's reading your work. He reads everything that we send. He's on the board of NCITE and asks questions. He's very engaged with all the deliverables and products we put out. So direct to National Security Council ears when you're doing the scientific work that NCITE's engaged in. So thank you for being an advocate for science and for using it to inform your policy, but also helping us get better to ask the right questions. So with that, we are at time. It went by like that. So thank you so much for your time today. Getting you for 45 minutes, not on your phone, has been amazing. And I am so grateful to have had you be part of our consortium. Again, we will send out a recap of this as well as the video to everyone who attended, and you can watch it on our YouTube channel at unomaha.ncite.edu. So, oh, it's flashing up. Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for being here with us today, and I hope you get some sleep this weekend.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Again, I'm tremendously sorry that we had to delay this 2 weeks, but I appreciate everyone's flexibility. And I will close with one of my favorite phrases from the Department of Homeland Security. It's only 2 more work days till Monday. So have a good weekend.
Thanks.